Okay, it is 4 o'clock. Let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our special webinar on crisis in Ukraine, past, present, and future. I am Dr. Krister Knapp, a teaching professor in the Department of History at Washington University, where I teach courses in national security history, including the Cold War and US-Russia relations since the Cold War. Today's event is being co-sponsored by the Department of History's initiative, Crisis and Conflict and Historical Perspective, which I coordinate, and the Provost Office. Many people in both places, as well as in arts and science, marketing and communications, university advancement, public relations, and other offices on campus have been working hard these past few days to assemble this event on short notice. I would especially like to thank Beverly Wendland, the Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor, and Kia Caldwell, Vice Provost for Faculty of Affairs and Diversity, for their leadership. Today's event will be a webinar in which each panelist will speak in turn for a set period of time, followed by Q&A from the audience. You can use the Q&A function on your screen to send questions to me, and I will filter through them at the end. Today's event is being recorded. We are live and on the record. You will be able to find a link to it on the WashU Arts and Science YouTube page. So before we get started, I would like to introduce our very distinguished panelists. I'll begin with Jim Wertsch. Professor Wertsch is the David R. Francis Distinguished Professor. He's a professor of sociocultural anthropology, professor of global studies, and director emeritus of the McDonnell International Scholars Academy. Professor Wertsch studies language, thought, and culture with a special focus on national memory and narrative. His publications include Vygotsky and the Social Formation of Mind, Voices of the Mind, Mind as Action, Voices of Collective Remembering, and just out from Oxford University Press last year, How Nations Remember, which will be very crucial for understanding the run-up to this invasion. Professor Wertsch earned his PhD at the University of Chicago, which we'll try not to hold against him, and has held faculty positions at Northwestern University, the University of California, San Diego, Clark University, and of course, WashU, where he has been Vice Chancellor for International Affairs. Jim is also a fellow in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and has been a guest professor at multiple universities, including in Oslo, Beijing, and Shanghai. Next up, equally distinguished, of course, is Professor Leila Sadat. She is the James Carr Professor of International Criminal Law and Director of the Whitney R. Harris World Law Institute at WashU School of Law. She also serves as Special Advisor on Crimes Against Humanity to the International Court Prosecutor, and formerly served as a member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Professor Sadat is one of the world's foremost authorities in the fields of public international law, international criminal law, human rights, and foreign affairs. And she has published more than 160 books and articles in leading journals, academic presses, and media outlets. She was the first woman selected to hold the Alexis de Tocqueville Distinguished Fulbright Chair in Paris, in France, in 2011, and received an honorary doctorate from Northwestern University, as well as the Arthur Holly Compton Faculty Achievement Award from Washington University in 2017. Leila also directs the well-known Crimes Against Humanity Initiative, the world's first global treaty on crimes against humanity. And she is also the president of the International Law Association American Branch, a counselor of the American Society of International Law, and a member of the American Law Institute and the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Betson is the 36th Professor of Military Science at Washington University's Gateway Battalion. He is a graduate of West Point. After that, Drew earned his MA in Diplomacy from the University of Kentucky and a Master of Military Arts and Science from the United States Army Command General Staff College. Lieutenant Colonel Betson has 18 years of experience as an armor and cavalry officer in the U.S. Army, with 4 combat tours, 3 in Iraq as a platoon leader, planner and company commander, and operations officer, and 1 in Afghanistan at Bagram Airfield. Drew has also earned numerous awards and decorations, including 2 Bronze Stars for combat service, a Defense Meritorious Service Medal, the Combat Action Badge, and the Military Order of St. George Bronze Level. He has also published numerous articles on warfare, including Nothing is Simple in Afghanistan, the Principle of Sustainment and Logistics in Alexander's Shadow. And finally, we have Janis Skrastins. He's an assistant professor of finance in the Olin Business School at WashU. His research focuses on financial intermediation, labor economics, and organizational economics. His work investigates how financial frictions affect households and firms, and his more recent work examines the implications of credit constraints on labor market outcomes and individual mortality, and how to improve credit contracts to expand access to finance. Janis's work on labor economics analyzes the incentive effects of unemployment insurance, worker mobility, and risk sharing between firms and employees. And his work also provides empirical insights on the trade-offs of organizational design and their broader implications for the real economy. His work has received several Best Paper Awards and has been published in outlets such as the Journal of Political Economy and Journal of Finance. Janis received his PhD in finance from the London Business School, his Master of Science in Corporate Finance from University of Amsterdam, and his Bachelor of Science in Business Economics from Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. So as you can see, we have a very distinguished panel. So let me give a brief overview, and then we'll get to some statements and opening remarks by our panelists. As many of you know, on February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine and is currently waging war against the Ukrainian armed forces, the government of Ukraine, and Ukrainian citizens. In just 2 short weeks, the conflict has produced thousands of casualties, an estimated 2 million refugees. Both of those numbers are expected to go much higher. Uncounted displaced persons, and many foreign nationals remain trapped inside of Ukraine. Energy systems have been disrupted, including Ukraine's nuclear power plants. Water and food is scarce, and there has already been much wanton destruction of property and infrastructure. Today's webinar will examine the origins, current state, and possible future of the crisis in Ukraine. So Jim, I'd like to begin with you. You have written a great deal about Russia, its history, its culture, its national psyche, its leaders. Now, many commentators, as we all know, have recently sought to explain why Putin invaded. Why did Russia do this? Why now? And we know that those explanations include restoring Russia's Eurasian empire, reigniting Russian colonialism, settling longstanding Russo-Ukrainian border disputes, halting further NATO enlargement, which the Russians see as NATO encroachment, destabilizing the European security architecture, repelling encroaching democracy, detracting from domestic unrest, solidifying power at home, and defending Russian orthodoxy against corrosive Western values, among other reasons. So you recently wrote a very insightful piece in the South China Times, and in your segment, I wonder if you might elaborate some of these reasons and explain your own view as to why Putin has invaded Ukraine.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Krister, and thanks, Bev and Kia, for organizing this terrific event. I want to start by saying it's hard to be overly alarmed with what's going on right now. Many people, it's not just me saying this by any means, but many people see us on the eve of World War III. It's that serious for a lot of people. It's serious for me personally because we have personal friends trying to travel across Ukraine to get to Poland, and we've already known of another young person that was killed fighting. So this is it's a terrible time for individuals in St. Louis here, but around the world, but it's a very serious, sobering time for all of us. So as Krister said, I've been after this question, and in part for me, it's a much longer quest, I should say, trying to answer the question, what does Putin want? This has been asked for months now. We've gone round and round. There's a short list of things that Krister just mentioned about what he wants, but I want to add something which I see as a background force to all of these other kinds of claims and resentments that he has that I think help make sense of some of this, because we still are not finding a good solution the question what Putin wants. We're now past the ideas about does he want recognition from the West? Do you want a new discussion? We're into a full-fledged war. And so now I think it's still consistent with what I want to say here, but it goes to a deeper level and with deeper implications. First, I would say in this connection, it's a mistake to focus too much on Putin, the individual. Everybody's talking about did he become senile? Did he is he ill? Has something happened that made him really particularly upset? I think it's too much focus on the individual because for two reasons. First of all, when we focus on Putin, the individual, it kind of encourages us to think if we could just get him to step down one way or the other, then we could go back to better times. I don't know that we wouldn't find even more aggressive leader to replace him or leaders. But secondly, more important for my purposes is that we have to think about what I would say the worldview that Putin is channeling all the time. When he speaks, you can hear, after you look at a lot of his speeches and you look at the sources and you look at a lot of Russian history and philosophy, he's just basically, not quite parroting, but speaking through these other voices. And I like to think of these in terms of a grand Russian national narrative. There are more than one, but the Russian national narrative I have in mind is one that says Russia is once upon a time, it's like a fairy tale as mythic form. Russia was just sitting there and not really bothering anybody. It's suddenly attacked wantonly and viciously by an external enemy. Russia is almost destroyed as a civilization, but through heroic action by the Russian people. And by the way, it's the Russian people, not the Communist Party anymore. So this is not a Marxist thing. This is clearly Russian national. But through the suffering, heroism, and acting alone, and by acting alone, the Russian people throw out the external enemy and can start to live in a more decent way again. This is a national narrative that's been around for centuries. It's not something that's new with Putin, or it's not something new in the 20th century. So it's, to be sure, this is based on real traumatic episodes in Russian history. We shouldn't underplay the kind of suffering that Russia's had, like especially in World War II or the Great Patriotic War, what they call the Great Patriotic War. It's important to remember, terrible losses, great heroism on the part of American soldiers, but we lost something like 415,000 troops. Russia lost, we don't even know for sure, but probably on the order of 25 to 27 million troops and citizens. So it leaves a big scar. But this is the thing of it is, this is a national narrative that is based on traumatic events, but it's not just the Great Patriotic War. Basically, any Russian can give you, just list off a group of events: the Mongol invasion, the 14th century, the Poles in the 17th century, Charles XII from Sweden. We don't think of Sweden as being a world power, but one of the vicious, most destructive armies that there was in the 18th century. He was defeated finally by Peter the Great, 1709, in the Battle of Poltava, which is just slightly southeast of Kharkiv, which is all over the news today. Notes it's in Ukraine, today's Ukraine, but that's a Russian victories and Russian suffering. And of course, the Napoleonic War and then Hitler. So this is a pattern that Russians see. And they've basically, out of this has coalesced, out of all these specific narratives, has coalesced the kind of what I call a narrative template. It's like a cookie cutter that stamps out interpretations of all kinds of events. So we could understand it with Hitler, Napoleon. But what it's done is it's also grown in size and power such that this is a narrative template that's used to explain, to interpret other events that are very strange to us. So for example, communism. We think of communism as a Soviet Russian, pattern that almost destroyed the world in its own right. But no, for Russian nationalists, communism was an external enemy. Russia was not bothering anybody. Its external enemy that was infiltrated into Russia, almost destroyed its the Russian spirit and soul, and finally was pushed out after 70 years of Soviet rule. Alexander Solzhenitsyn talked about that in his 1978 commencement address to Harvard, where he talked, and people thought, oh, he's going to talk about the end of communism. He's on our side. No, he gave us a big lecture about how communism, but also capitalism for him, but communism in the immediate short term was an enemy, external enemy that almost destroyed Russia. So you see this in widespread, not just among intellectuals. I remember a time I was in Moscow in 2017, I think, came out of my hotel, getting a taxi to go to the airport, made chit chat with the taxi driver. And it was after the Russian-Georgian War of 2008, which is where there was a massive invasion of Russia into a very tiny little country, Georgia, and Russians carved off two segments of Georgia, a so-called autonomous region. So I asked a taxi driver at one point about the Russian president, Mikhail Saakashvili. I said, what do you think of Saakashvili? And this is a taxi driver. He is informed, but he immediately said, well, I don't think he knew very much about Hitler. The implication is Georgia was the aggressor that was trying to destroy Russia, and it was a real danger. And if Saakashvili had realized what happened to Hitler, he wouldn't have tried that. It's not just Georgia in these cases, and it's not just Ukraine today. These are viewed as cases by NATO, the West, where these others are puppets of the West. They're viewed as just the tip of the spear for NATO to try to destroy Russia. So the point is, Russians can spot threats in all kinds of ways and make sense of them in ways that are very surprising to us. They can see danger where it's very hard for us to think, and we start talking about paranoia or something. And I should note right now, but I'll go back to this, none of this excuses in any way the invasion of Ukraine. Never excused the invasion of Georgia. So it's not an excuse, but it's important to understand this, I think. And so now this, as a kind of underlying widespread Russian national narrative that's shared widely by the general public, has recently been put on steroids by Putin, who has a new kind of philosopher that he's really peddling these days, and that's Ivan Ilyin, somebody who is from Russia, died in 1954 in exile in Switzerland. Putin's become very enamored of him. He's read him. He's told his all those surrounding him they should read him. He brought back Ilyin's body from Switzerland. He brought back his archives from Michigan State. So he's a kind of state philosopher for Putin. And Olin developed a kind of what can only be called Christian fascism, Christian Orthodox fascism for Russia. And if you read him, it's striking how radical this is. And among other things, it means you can only have one all-powerful leader that has direct contact with the spirit of the people. You have to be totally brutal in any kind of internal or external enemies that threaten this, because you are on a mission, a grand Russian religious mission and national mission, which is important for the world, not just even for local areas. And that might surprise a lot of people, but this is really giving a lot of play in Putin and his henchmen, or whatever you like to call them. But the point is, now we have a system where there's an underlying national narrative that people generally agree on and buy into big time. And now you have a kind of top-down organizing philosophy that's being peddled. And together, it's an interlocking system that is really backed kind of Russian interpretation further into a corner. Just one little illustration of this. There are many of these illustrations these days, probably thousands, but hundreds we hear about on the social media and elsewhere. There are endless cases where somebody, for example, a Ukrainian son in Ukraine calls up his father in Moscow and said, "Dad, the Russian army is here. They're attacking us." Dad said, "No, that's not happening." The son shows him a picture out of his window of a destroyed building. Dad said, "No, that's probably Photoshopped." And it drives people crazy to hear this on the other side. But basically, they have to just stop talking as a family because this is so deep-seated. Now, we oftentimes say, well, that's because the Russian media controls things. They are controlling things, to be sure. Although until recently, a lot of people had access to internet who found other things. But I'm talking about something, a narrative habit that really governs the way a lot of people think in Russia. Again, none of this excuses anything that Putin has done recently, the brutal, crazy invasion. And so the issue then, I think what we're after is how to proceed. And basically, you're not going to talk Putin or a lot of people out of this national narrative. No amount of evidence talks them out of that, just like we have national narratives that no amount of evidence will talk us out of in many cases. So, and again, it's not to excuse Putin, but it is to try to understand what drives him. What does he want? And what he's after, I think, it's not he wakes up thinking about every day, but it's the background of all these other local forces and events. He needs to restore the great Russian nation, the Russian world, Ruski Mir. That's his goal. And just one indication of this, basically all Russians know the expression, Moscow is a third Rome. This is an expression that basically we don't know about at all, but in the Russian story, Rome was the first Rome, became corrupt, decrepit, just venal. They moved to Constantinople, second Rome. Again, they became corrupted venal. Now they're in Moscow, which is a true, pure Christian visionary for the rest of the world, and certainly for Russia, for them. So what do you do about this? Instead of trying to talk people out of it, which we could still do and should do, but I think that many of the things we're doing, economic sanctions, and these are hitting people a lot. People going to ATM and finding out they don't have their account anymore, or there's a zero balance or something. Pensioners are a potent force in Russia. Popular opinion does work there in a lot of ways. People are panicked about their pensions, about their children's future. But there are other sources of influence, and sources that, if there's any way that will pull back Putin, I think we're going to see the soft side of these forces coming into play more and more. It's the army. The army is made up a lot of conscripts. They're fighting what they just got through calling their brothers. Putin insisted that Ukraine is actually not a separate nation, it's Russian. So you're Russians killing Russians if you follow that. So the army is potentially a soft spot. The loyalty is questionable. We've seen indications that leaders in the security and financial sectors, pensioners, they get a lot of attention. They have and mothers and grandmothers. These are some of the toughest characters there are out there. There are pictures of grandmothers. In Ukraine, there's something like an 83-year-old grandmother learning how to shoot a Kalashnikov. Said, I'm not going to leave. There's a woman in St. Petersburg marching. She was a survivor of the Leningrad siege. She's 73 now or something, just a baby, but when she was there where she was born. But she's out carrying a poster telling Putin, get out of Ukraine. These get on social media a little bit, but they're also extremely embarrassing because these are not acting like Putin assumed they would. And then, I do certainly encourage us to think of even more ways to support Ukrainian military. I think it's not a smart idea to think about no-fly zones. That's something that would put us in direct military confrontation with Russia. Got to remember, we're in a different era because of nuclear weapons. You can push somebody way into a corner with nothing left to lose, but they do have one thing they can get back at you if they're really panicked, humiliated, and totally angry. And so somehow we've got to continue to navigate this needle. There are 5,000 protesters in Russia who are now in jail. And these are terrible, long sentences. They're still coming out in the streets. That's how strongly a lot of people. So if we can find ways to support them, to keep viable democratic colleagues in contact with us because they are working, and find ways to reduce the media blackout they had there. Those are they're the old instruments, but I think it's important to understand this is a larger force than just Putin dreaming up these things. And it's not just his mental illness or whatever you think it is. That's an issue here. He's been talking about this for a long time. So those explanations just don't work for us very well. So thanks very much. I look forward to hearing some other angles on this terrible situation we're in.
Okay, thanks, Jim. That was really great. That really helped us understand the long history. I think that's a very powerful view about the Russian narrative of victimization here. You provided a nice segue for us to talk about the Russian military. So I'd like to move on next to Drew. Drew, you're a seasoned intellectual warrior with experience in and theoretical knowledge about warfare and battlefield tactics, logistics, and operations. We've certainly heard a great deal in recent days about Russia's lackluster military performance, as well as the better than expected Ukrainian military defense. But most of us don't really understand how the conflict is unfolding. So I wonder whether you can explain to us non-experts just how the military campaign is shaping up on both sides. And so in particular, I think a lot of people would like to know, is the Russian military winning? Are they losing? What about the Ukrainians? Are we stalemated? Who might be victorious here? And so what really does your experience tell you about the military nature of this conflict?
Yeah, thanks, Doctor. I appreciate it. Hey, sir, a great talk. Babushka back home, big part of decision making. I will say the comment about the brothers, the brothers in fighting. It's almost like a boxing match. You have that, the gentleman's boxing match, and you're trying to be a fun or kind boxing match until that first person gets punched in the nose, and then suddenly the boxing match goes out of control. So thanks again. Thanks, Dr. Knapp. And by the way, great interdisciplinary team pulled together here, and unsurprisingly, you've got the obligatory history professor books behind you. So that's fantastic. I'm really excited to join in this academic discussion that revolves around kind of a rapidly changing environment. I do have to say, so nothing that I say necessarily reflects the positions of the United States government, the Defense Department, United States Army Cadet Command, or Washington University for that matter. And I will say, while I do have a security clearance in my current position, I do not have access to any secret sources. So everything that I'm going to be talking about is all either open source or just a product of my own analysis here. So Krister, talking about, thinking through kind of what's going on, this current situation, I guess my task is really kind of provide a military science perspective to what's really going on. I thought that using theoretical frameworks from United States Army doctrine, I found is one of the ways that I have my cadets try to understand things, and I can kind of bucket things, which is helpful. So I think we'll start with the Russians. They're on the offense. They've got the initiative, so we'll start with them. So in our Army doctrine, the characteristics of the offense, we have 4. It's audacity, surprise, concentration, and tempo. So audacity, surprise, concentration, tempo, and I'll take those in turn. So audacity, this is clearly a very audacious plan. The Russians decided to attack on multiple axes against a modern force, which is involving forces from all of Russia's military districts. Russia's military is divided into joint military districts around their country. And so they pulled in forces from all over to try to conduct this attack. Depending on the source that you look at, you find that there's about 3 to 5 axes of advance that we see. The main effort or the decisive operation that we think that it is kind of Kiev. There's the axis toward Kiev on either side of the Dnieper River, coming out of Belarus and also coming over from Russia on the east side of the Dnieper. But also you've got the axis out of Sumy. The Sumy axis, that's an elite armored column from the 1st Guards Tank Army, and we think that's really focused on trying to come in on the east side of Kiev and for isolating that city. Then you've got the Kharkov axis. That appears right now to be, that's forces from the Arctic Brigade, which is actually brought down from the Northern Fleet. So pretty elite brigade that's got good high-end technology, weapon systems and vehicles. That's what was fighting in Kharkov, or is fighting in Kharkov. And then you'll hear about the Donbas axis. My read is that actually the Donbas axis is parts of the 2 axes out of the north, out of Lugansk. I think that's actually supporting to the north. It's an attack out in support of the Kharkov fight. And then out of Donetsk, I think that's supporting the south, which is this final axis, the Crimea axis. Out of Crimea, you see an attack that's kind of coming up into the west toward Odessa, and then also up and toward the east, which is right now, what we're really seeing is kind of the attacking to see some of those key points. Right now, we can see the isolation surrounding of Mariupol and the things that are going there. Determining the objectives, kind of military objectives, is a little bit difficult. Kind of difficult because how poorly the first phase really went for the Russians. So we're still trying to figure all that out. It does appear that they're looking to seize key terrain, namely the cities of Kiev and Kharkov. Major population centers and also cultural icons for Ukraine, but also kind of the seizure of those key ports in the south, right there on the Sea of Azov, and also on the northern Black Sea. Watching to see that in terms of the limited objectives that could potentially be used in the longer term for achieving political objectives. I'm also looking right now kind of in that kind of eastern side, the deeper envelopments right now, and how those axes really potentially cutting off the Ukrainian forces, deep envelopments cutting off the Ukrainian forces defending in the east there. So when you look at this, right, an audacious plan like this, they're really operating what we call external lines of operations. This is Geminian concept, external lines of operations. It's nice to be able to attack from all sides. It's a good thing for you if you're able to attack, because you can put pressure on a defending force from multiple angles, presents them multiple problems that they're trying to deal with all at the same time. The downside with external lines, though, is that it's got to be synchronized. It's got to be synchronized to achieve that desired effect that you're trying to have on the defending force. Command and control in large operations is always difficult. Command and control when you're executing external lines is particularly difficult. And then add on top of that these are forces that have come from all over the area, all over Russia. It's quite the challenge, right? And the other thing for command and control is the military districts that I mentioned. They're really administrative commands. So it's not like that's something you can just say, okay, we're going to have them suddenly operate as a field army with all of the expectations you'd have for that higher level command and control. So these are all challenges that they'll face. It's further complicated by the airborne factors that were included in the attack as well. Finally, supplying external lines of operations, that's a difficult thing, because if you're going to shift supplies, you got to shift them all the way around to reinforce success or whatever it might be. So that's that audacity. Like I said, the audacious plan. Now, surprise is second. Being on the offense, the initiative, they've got the initiative. They're really able to achieve that. The tactical surprise, in theory, is something they can achieve because they picked the time that they were allowed to attack. So that's good. But tactics is just battles and engagements, and they've got to be collectively aimed at something. We talk about the operational level of war. In Russian theory, Russian operational art really relies on operational level surprise. They've got their own term for it, and for actually achieving that operational surprise, that relies on operational deception. And for them, they actually have a word. It's called maskirovka. It's that operational deception, and really it's a coordinated echelons. That means that at the operational level and the strategic level, and we really saw that leading up to seeing how the Russians were really trying to keep everybody on their back foot. Now, all of that is aimed at trying to achieve what they call operational shock. The Russian word is udar. One of the ways that they do that is by the use of airborne forces. Some of you all will hear VDV getting thrown around there. That's the Vozduzhna Desyanty Vaiska. It's the descent force. It's airborne, meant to get in and hit the enemy hit their foe all in the depth of their forces. Now, it appears that they didn't really achieve this surprise. Maybe first, it was a little bit spoiled by some of the intelligence sharing that was going on prior to the war, but also, the airborne operations did not go well. Airborne operations went poorly, which is it's really kind of tied to the Russian miscalculations moving in, which brings us kind of to our next topic, which is concentration. So, in Army parlance, concentration is the massing of fires. It's bringing all of the elements to bear all at once: artillery, air, ground forces, all at once. Now, we didn't see this in the beginning, and I know it's not. If you've been keeping track of this, it's turning out to be kind of what everybody's saying. We did not see the massing of fires. We particularly did not see the notorious Russian artillery in lots of our areas. In air-ground integration, we talk about the air, right? These things are hard to do. So concentrating your force is really, really hard. And so tied back to that command and control, you're suddenly saying that you're going to integrate all those things together in a large operation. It's really tough. On top of that, like the deep penetrations that we saw in the airborne forces, the airborne operations, they were not practicing combined arms maneuver. They were really, they weren't doing what we would normally think that they would do if they thought that they were going to be facing off against a determined defensive force. So as they started entering kind of the natural realm of warfare, which is fog, friction, and uncertainty, losses started to mount. And this included lightly armed convoys going into Kharkov were destroyed, just driving into Kharkov. And so in terms of that miscalculation, really what we see is, the problem for Russia is that, that's a costly miscalculation in time, and also, some of the points that Dr. Wertsch was talking about. So now, we talked about, that now what we see for them, we think the Russians right now, everything is slowed down. They're starting to concentrate their forces. They're really going to start achieving that local air superiority to do their fighting, to ensure that they're not going to be, because they're fighting a force with will and capacity. So as they start to adjust, that I think that's what we're probably going to see next. The last bit there for the offense is tempo, right? So tempo. This is something that can be gained and lost over the course. It will be gained and lost over the course of over the course of operations. It also can be fast, but it can all tempo. You can still have tempo, but it just being slow. You've seen the reports of the loss of tempo and kind of with this original plan that's not, that was, light, the expectation of light defense. Now that can have cascading effects on a plan, particularly a logistical plan. Now it's hard to tell right now. Operational strategic tempo, that's something that we're still trying to figure out. That's still in the fog of of this fight. But we saw kind of what happens there. Clearest example is the famous now 40-mile long convoy, right? This is actually probably likely a collection of different elements, not all together, but we've seen some pictures. It's probably combat arms and combat service support elements all making their way to start do this concentration. Now those elements, they've probably been canalized, and they've been canalized by the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians were able to react. They downed some bridges, which really canalized those forces. Now, one of the things we are seeing, though, is we've seen a lot of the pictures of the convoys, not seen a lot of attacks on those convoys, which that starts to be an indicator that maybe Russia it's building its capability to establish local area security and actually continue to conduct its operations. As I transition, I'll talk about the Ukrainian defense here. There are 7 principles or characteristics of the defense, but I'm not going to talk about all of them because I'm up on time, because of the nature of time. If the Russians are operating on external lines, the Ukrainians are operating on internal lines, right? So the benefit is that you can shift forces between these axes of advance from an internal spot. So those internal lines of operations are good, particularly if the enemy is discombobulated or not constant or not synchronized in their attack. One of the key characteristics of the defense is preparation, right? If on the offense, the benefit is that you've got the initiative. On the defense, you're able to prepare. And so for the Ukrainians, their ability to create kill boxes, or we call them engagement areas, that's where a unit can really integrate all of the different elements, the direct fire, indirect fire, all that planning can come together. And it appears that the Ukrainians really took the time to develop their engagement areas. They also took advantage of kind of multiple years of military training and foreign military sales to, start to make some attempts over the last 8 years or so, for further attempts to professionalize their army, but also to arm themselves with these lethal capabilities that we've been seeing. And then just in terms of, the internal lines of operations and kind of early intelligence, it does appear that they were able to orient their forces. I mentioned the First Guard tank army coming out of Sumy. If you know that that's where the elite armor is coming from, that's where you're going to mask some of those anti-armor capabilities, and it looks like that's what happened. Operations in depth, they've really been able to do so. Land defense is going to be an area defense. They can trade space for time if they're on defense. But what I am seeing, for some of these initial successes and tactical successes, we'll have to watch in the East, particularly as they start getting enveloped. Eventually, somebody's got to make the call that you've got to either, withdraw your forces, and retrograde operations are extremely difficult. And then finally, I'll just wrap it up with so flexibility. Flexibility. This is problematic for the Ukrainians when they're in the defense, as they're kind of fighting in the places in Mariupol, and they're having to defend out there and kind of answer that call. Again, the maneuver that we've been seeing, the deep movements, even though they were discombobulated, as they start to slow down, and we already see what's happening in Mariupol, the defense is going to be challenged as they pull out. So that's off the defense. Last thing I'll talk about, you mentioned winning and losing. Hard to tell right now. What I do think right now is important for everybody to remember is stability operations. Stability operations, these always must happen. If this is going to carry on into a long campaign, there are areas that the Russians have either bypassed, or there are areas that the Russians are now have seized control of. Doing the stability operations in that area is fundamental to military operations. It's hard enough to try to establish establish governance and the provision of essential services in these areas, but in their rear right now, all of that is hard enough without having to also fight to establish security in the area, because depending to see how the guerrilla forces that may or may not come out at the tail end of this conflict, it's going to be a challenge to see how that goes. So with that, I'll stop. I'll look forward to any questions in the end, and I look forward to the next briefers.
Great. Drew, thank you very much. That's a really concrete, detailed look at both the Russian and the Ukrainian militaries and where this is headed. And it's a scary thought, I think, for most of us to think the Russians have not brought the full force of their might to bear, given all the destructions they've done so far, which unfortunately is a nice segue to our next panelist. And so, Leila, I'd like to turn to you, because another crucial part of the conflict, of course, is that no matter how you analyze war, it is about killing. And in the end of the day, there are lots of innocent people who are being killed. And there have been multiple credible reports of attacks against civilians, either in their homes or while trying to flee through evacuation corridors, as well as those, of course, on schools and hospitals. Just today, we saw an attack on a maternity ward and children's hospital. The mounting carnage is horrific, and I think for most of us, very difficult to process, as Jim was saying earlier. Now, of course, we all know that after World War II, we built the liberal international order that included a number of international legal institutions, laws, and treaties designed to prohibit the worst aspects of war. But 75 years later, we seem to be witnessing some of the worst violations of those very laws and norms. I'm wondering if you can help us understand the legal framework for what is happening in Ukraine, and especially help shed some light on us for what many of us believe is an egregious violation of human rights. How are we to make sense of this conflict from an international law and human rights perspective? Are we witnessing crimes against humanity in Ukraine?
Thank you so much, Krister. And I learned so much from listening to Jim and Drew, so thank you. I am speaking, like Drew, I'm in my personal capacity here as an academic. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. I served the first prosecutor for 9 years, from 2012 until 2020. Gosh, it was a long time. And now I'm the special advisor on crimes against humanity for Karim Khan, who is the new prosecutor, but here, obviously, in my personal capacity. So like Drew, all the information I'm giving you is open source. And there was a question about websites. And if the chat's open, I can type some websites into the chat, if that would be helpful in answering that. So as you heard Jim and Drew lay the sort of the framework for what is happening here, we had, whether it was surprisingly or unsurprisingly, we had the Russian Federation move in after a couple of weeks of troop buildups, attempts to negotiate, and finally they move in on February 21st, and they declare these two areas of the Donbass region to actually be independent countries. They order a mass evacuation of the civilian residents, and we have a cross-border invasion of one sovereign nation state into another. It's not the first time it happened. Crimea obviously was another situation in which we had a cross-border incursion, and I'm going to come back to Crimea. But this one was different in kind. Russia's parliament subsequently approves the use of military force in the Ukraine, and the full invasion itself is then actually undertaken as the Security Council is meeting with on the urging of Ukraine, which is called for an emergency session. And the Russian Federation in February had the presidency of the Security Council. So the optics of that meeting and the pleading of states with the president, with each other, was really quite dramatic. And the students in my international law class got to watch some of that, because I've been playing some of what's been going on for them as they're seeing international law be made. What happened during that meeting, of course, is that 11 states voted to condemn the invasion and try to muster the council to address the threat to international peace and security. 3 abstained, including China and India, and Russia vetoed the resolution. Russia has a veto, as does the United States and 3 other permanent members, but it was shocking to hear Russia defend its use of the veto in that context. And then the Russian ambassador gave sort of a fiery defense of what they were doing, arguing that it was the Ukrainians' fault because, in fact, they were committing acts of genocide in this eastern region of Ukraine. So the United States and others went to step 2, and 40 states, I think about 40 states, and actually I think this was about 80 states, introduced a procedural resolution, which can't be vetoed, essentially asking the General Assembly to convene on something called the Uniting for Peace resolution. And the General Assembly then did so because there's no veto in the General Assembly. And anybody watching this would have seen Linda Thomas Greenfield, our ambassador to the United Nations, saying, you can veto this resolution, but you can't veto our voices. And she's really quite an impressive ambassador. So it moves to the General Assembly. The General Assembly votes overwhelmingly to be seized of the situation, to condemn the invasion. 141 states voted for that. Again, we had 5 voting against: the Russian Federation, Belarus, and 3 others. Unsurprising. And what was interesting, and maybe we can come back to this, is again, China abstains. And so one of the things that we had worried about, in terms of the World War III, the parade of horribles, one of the things we had worried about was what would happen, in fact, if there was a Chinese vote with Russia in the United Nations. That would have been terrifying for a lot of reasons. And we're not seeing that. We're actually seeing China calling for diplomacy and an end to the conflict, which I think is at least a silver lining, even though it's not solving the conflict. So we look at the United Nations Charter. This is an act of aggression. It violates the most fundamental norm. It is true that the Charter and the United Nations itself is only as strong as the nations supporting the United Nations. And so one of the things I think we have to look at when we ask, is the UN up to the job of responding to this, is the United States was defunding the United Nations for, 20, 30 years, and stripping it of a lot of the resources that might have helped. And we're going to come to the International Criminal Court, which suffered even more under the prior administration. So the United Nations has now sprung into action. The Human Rights Council has sprung into action. There was a fiery moment there with diplomats leaving. We've seen there's a UN Commission of Inquiry that's been stood up. And interestingly, Ukraine has brought an action to the International Court of Justice, which is known as the World Court in The Hague. And they have argued that it's actually Russia violating the Genocide Convention. And hearings were held on that case. It was really quite extraordinary. Again, I showed some of the hearings to my students in real time. Ukraine brought the action to the court under the Genocide Convention and said, Russia, you're lying about your misuse of the Genocide Convention. There's no genocide here committed by us. And if there was an action, it's a military invasion isn't what you do to solve it. You come to court or you settle the dispute through peaceful means. And so Ukraine is using every legal tool it can. The European Union has been engaged. The Council of Europe has been engaged. The OECD, just about anything you can think of. And we'll come back to why might law matter, right? Why might law matter when we're thinking of the military conflict on the ground? And then the third big tranche, which has been alluded to, is the International Criminal Court. Ukraine came to the court in 2014 and 2015. It couldn't ratify the statute for a variety of reasons, but it deposited declarations that asked the International Criminal Court to look at crimes committed on its territory. Now, the ICC has 4 crimes in its jurisdiction. It has war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. The problem with the crime of aggression, which is really the one that we're sort of talking about here, which is the decision to invade another sovereign state, is that it's a very limited jurisdiction. You have to ratify the aggression amendments, and both states have to have done so under most readings of the treaty. So the ICC would not be able to take jurisdiction over aggression, unlike the Nuremberg Tribunal that had that jurisdiction. And so there's been some talk from the UK and other states States of creating a specialized tribunal just to deal with aggression. I think that has some difficulties, but it could be interesting, especially if they can go back in time and look at Crimea, where there was actually an annexation of a piece of another sovereign state. The crimes that the ICC can look at, though, and the two really, nobody's alleging in a serious way genocide at the ICC, although it is coming up at the ICJ, the civil court, right, the interstate court. And at the ICC, there have been allegations of war crimes and crimes against humanity dating all the way back to 2013. And what is fascinating is if you look at the reports, again, in the public, so I'm not giving you secret information out of the office of the prosecutor, but the public documents that the office of the prosecutor issues at the end of every year in December that talks about the situations on her or now his docket. And these are situations that were in something we call preliminary examination, meaning that she was looking at, do I have jurisdiction? Is it admissible? And is there a reasonable basis to believe that crimes within the jurisdiction of the court have been committed? And in 2015 and 2016, the prosecutor hedged a little bit about crimes against humanity, saying that the attacks on the Maidan protesters and others were human rights violations, but might not have risen to the level of crimes against humanity. By 2017, 2018, 2019, more evidence had been adduced. The prosecutor had received evidence of thousands of incidents, thousands of individuals killed, disappearance, torture, mistreatment, some allegations of sexual and gender-based violence, and concluded that, in fact, in 2020, there was a reasonable basis to believe, and that's even before the current conflict, that crimes against humanity and war crimes had occurred on the territory of Ukraine from 2013 forward. Now, if we go back to 2020, especially prior to the election of a new president in the United States, some people might remember that the ICC prosecutor and one of her chief deputies was actually under sanctions by the United States. And the Trump administration had imposed crippling sanctions on the prosecutor personally, not on the institution, but on her personally, because the ICC had opened an investigation into Afghanistan, which is also a state that had ratified the statute and accepted the jurisdiction of the court. And if we have time in the Q&A, I'll talk about that. But as you can imagine, the court felt very much under siege in 2020. And the prosecutor decided for that and a variety of other reasons that she wasn't going to open the Ukraine investigation herself and she was going to wait for a new prosecutor to do so. She concluded that there was a reasonable basis to believe crimes had been committed, not necessarily by the high-ranking leaders of the Russian Federation, right? War crimes and crimes against humanity. There were also armed groups operating in the territory of Ukraine. And one of the things that the Ukrainians did by accepting the jurisdiction of the court is they accepted that even they could be subject to ICC investigation. And one of the conclusions there was that there had been crimes committed on both sides, especially, again, this is all public, especially there was a reasonable basis to believe that perhaps during detention of Russian soldiers or others detaining Ukrainians, that there had been crimes within the ICC's jurisdiction. As I said, she didn't move forward for a variety of reasons, including the Trump sanctions and a question of priorities for her office. When Karim Khan was elected the next year and he took over, Ukraine sat until obviously this happened. And at that point, he said, I'm going to open an investigation. Why is that important? I think it is important. The way Jim put it is you don't want to personalize this too much. And yet, the famous language from the Nuremberg Tribunal is that it's individuals that commit crimes. It's not states or the international community or vague organizations. It's actually, and the language is crimes are not committed by abstract entities, but by men. and women, I should add, being gender neutral. So one of the things that is important here is for all the parties to the conflict to understand that they are now under the active investigative jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court prosecutor. And one of the things that Karim Khan did was, because when he opens the investigation on his own initiative, he actually has to get permission from a pretrial chamber to do that. He can't just open investigations. States don't like the prospect of an individual with that much power. So they subject what he does or she does to judicial review. But what happened then is he invited states to give him the referral, and 39 states stepped up to the plate and said, please open the Ukraine investigation. We need this to go forward quickly. And I'm hoping that other states will as well, because going back to what Jim said, there's some geopolitics here. It would be nice if it wasn't just European countries and Australia, Canada, et cetera, who are asking the ICC to intervene. It would be great for this to be seen as a truly global, unified effort to say, absolutely not, this kind of action is off the table. And so we're hoping some African state, there have been some in the General Assembly, there were some African and Latin American states, but not enough. We want to have a broader global consensus about this. So the ICC investigation is open now. All states, Ukraine and Russia, are subject to the prosecutor's jurisdiction, and we are seeing evidence of very, very serious crimes. Again, I can't opine because it's different to say, as Drew knows, to say there's a violation of the laws and customs of war is not the same as saying, oh, and so is a war criminal, because you have to show intent and knowledge. You have to show that it was done purposefully. But at the same time, the bombing of a maternity hospital, the bombing of schools, the shelling of cities, none of this is acceptable under the laws and customs of war. We would consider this an international armed conflict. There may be a non-international armed conflict happening at the same time in this eastern Ukraine area, because you have the government fighting these kind of organized armed groups that are splintered. But it seems that Russia has been in control. At least the Office of the Prosecutor believes that those activities are also attributable to the Russian Federation. So having the ICC in the game is really important. It's never going to be just the civil case or just the criminal case. What we're also seeing, and I'm sure that Janis is going to talk about this, is crippling economic sanctions. And the crippling economic sanctions are being levied by states that are closing their ports. The United States just closed their ports, closing their airspace, banning Russian imports. We're seeing private businesses doing the same. We're seeing sanctions, a sanctions regime like we've never seen before, undertaken under the EPA, which authorizes President Biden. It's the same law we used actually to sanction the prosecutor, which is terrible, and the same law we used to sanction Iran during the Iran hostages crisis way back. So this law has been on the books for a long time, and then the president issues executive orders pursuant to this that imposes various kinds of economic sanctions. So I think the full weight of the global sort of United Nations system, all the courts and tribunals, the regional actors, the criminal court, and even the WTO is going to be in the action, because the import bans probably violate the GATT and have to be justified as national security exceptions. So I think you're seeing kind of the entire 75 years, if you like, of constructing a global international legal order come down with the full weight of everything it can muster to try to bring Russia back to the bargaining table. And that's where, you know, to the extent, I don't think this is going to be settled militarily in some positive way. The hope, at least, is to bring them back to the table, to de-escalate the conflict, and to do it in a way that doesn't leave Ukraine in pieces, because that would be a really terrible result. So I think I'll stop there. Hopefully I've given folks a flavor of what us international lawyers are doing these days to try to address this. And let's all just pray for the Ukrainians, because it's pretty awful, and for the Russian soldiers who are dying, frankly, in an illegal war. And nobody should have to go and die for their country in an illegal war. So thank you.
Leila, just really fantastic. I think we can all agree that a diplomatic solution and a negotiated settlement sooner rather than later is the best way to go here. your comments remind me, and I think a lot of us, that there are two worlds out there: the social reality that most of us experience on a daily basis, and then the world you inhabit called legal reality. And that we're trying to bridge those two things. And I think your comments did that very nicely. I should say the questions are pouring in, and they're all of your comments have anticipated these questions. I want to get to those, but we have, as you mentioned in your own segue, a very important aspect to get to. And that, of course, is the economic angle, and particularly a focus on sanctions. So I want to finally turn to Janis. Janis, I'd like to expand the conversation outward a bit more and shift to the West's response here. The United States and its allies and partners have responded to the invasion on a variety of fronts, including a remarkable unity of political condemnation. As Professor Sadat said, 75 years of the liberal international order are finally paying off here, I think, with the global condemnation. We have sent a fair amount of military hardware and military and non-military aid to Ukraine. And just today, Congress is working on bills through the system there to get even more billions of dollars sent to the Ukrainians. And of course, we have sent troops and military hardware to NATO countries on Ukraine's periphery, including Poland and Romania, as well as the Baltic states. But of course, the main response has been to enact a series of massive sanctions against Russia and high-profile Russians. Now, most of us probably realize that sanctions don't deter military action, but instead act as a punishment after such action. Yet I think we can all agree that we don't really understand what sanctions are, how they work, and why these sanctions in particular are said to be more devastating than anything we've seen before. So, Janis, in your remarks today, I wonder if you can also help us understand the sanctions regime and the impact they are having and will continue to have on Russia going forward, and how, to what extent might these affect Putin's calculations?
Thanks, Krister, for the opportunity to be here. So before I start, I actually want to thank Betson and other military servicemen and women who keep us safe. So in some sense, it's great that we can look at all this from the safety of our homes. And so thank you for that. So as many of you might have heard, right, that the US and the global allies have put very severe sanctions on Russia. So the primary target here is the Russia's financial sector, major companies, President Putin, his allies, and oligarchs. So the most recent addition to these sanctions was announced yesterday, right? The ban of US oil and gas imports to UK and US. And these sanctions are kind of in two groups. One group will talk about long-term, such as the export ban of technology, and the other group will be about short-term, immediate severe effects, which will be like blacklisting Russian banks. So what are these key measures? How do they work, and what do they intend to achieve? So as I said, the prime target really here is the Russia's financial sector. And I think the hope is really to achieve that, kind of limit Russia's ability to finance this war. So today I will focus on two components of these financial sanctions that I think are the most important. So the first one is crippling the central bank's ability to support the local currency. And number two, excluding large Russian banks from accessing international financial system. So let's start with the number one, which is kind of crippling the central bank's ability to support the exchange rate. So in some sense, there are two important ingredients here. The first one is kind of a simpler one, which is a ban to transact with Russia's central bank and many other government institutions. So this simply says that you can't do business with them, full stop. And the second one, which is actually, I think, more surprising, was that the West froze most of central banks' assets outside Russia. And this really surprised financial professionals, both in the West and in Moscow. In hindsight, if you look at how kind of Central Bank of Russia has accumulated its reserves and where it has actually put them, it seems that they clearly miscalculated the severity of Western sanctions that they could actually put together. So the solidarity was completely unexpected by the Russians. So what's really going on here? So since the annexation of Crimea, Putin was really kind of into this game of building a fortress Russia that could withstand sanctions. So he was trying to build up reserves and kind of insulate the economy. So result, what has happened is the central bank has amassed kind of substantial reserves of $630 billion of foreign reserves, which is about 38% of GDP. So what's really important here, which I guess is the big miscalculation, is that 2/3 of those reserves are located in countries or institutions that have sanctioned Russia. First, why reserves are important. So one of the primary objectives of central banks' reserves is to stabilize the local currency, which is the ruble, against other currencies. So how does it work? So imagine the situation where there are too many investors and institutions that try selling the ruble. So this will push the price of ruble down. So what central banks do in these situations, they liquidate some of their positions, buy up the ruble, and therefore keep stability on the exchange rate. Why stable exchange rate is important? So think about trade. It facilitates trade of goods internationally. It also helps servicing foreign obligations for Russia. So what does it mean to limit access to foreign reserves? So think about this very simple example, your checking account in a bank. So the bank freezes your checking account, you still own the checking account, but you can't access the money that's located in it. So this is effectively what has happened with Russia's central bank's assets. They just can't access them. So the way how they have placed them, they're located, large part of them is located in institutions and jurisdictions that have sanctioned Russia. So basically they have lost access to 2/3 of their reserves, really limiting its ability to stabilize the currency. So this in combination with the ban to actually do business with central bank and their limited resources of foreign reserves really kind of is a major blow in a very immediate term for Russian economy. And I will talk about what we already see in a minute. So the second important part of these sanctions, financial sanctions, relate to limiting access of Russian financial institutions to the international financial system. Here also there are kind of two ingredients. The first one is blacklisting some of the major financial institutions in Russia from dealing with the Western allies. And the second one is limiting Russia's access to the international payment system called SWIFT. So first, what does it mean to be blacklisted? So what does it say? It effectively prohibits you to do business with these banks. So if you decide to do business with them, you are likely to be fined with a hefty fine from the US authorities and its allies. So currently we have about 80%, so think about 80% of assets in the Russian financial system would be under this ban. And the second important measure is the access to the financial payment system called SWIFT, International Payment System. So what is SWIFT and how does it work? So SWIFT is a messaging system. So it helps to connect banks around the world whenever they want to actually make an international payment. They don't transfer the money themselves, but think about this as a secure way to communicate so that the sender, when they send money, they know exactly where the money will land at the end of the day. So it's kind of the messaging system. Why is it? What does it mean? It means if you can't access it, you can't send money internationally, at least in a very effective and fast way. So why blacklisting and limiting access to SWIFT is important? So if you're not being able to transfer funds internationally, this really impairs your ability to trade goods, both import and export internationally, right? It cuts off you from the global imports and exports. So in fact, it actually limits any international transfer of money. So this is also intended to have a very huge, very immediate impact on Russia's economy and its ability to wage the war. So there are also several important economic rather than financial sanctions. So the first one was announced some time ago already, a ban on exporting some key technologies such as semiconductors. And here the idea is that in a longer term, that would impair Russia's ability to actually advance as an economy. So it's kind of pushing them backwards in a longer term. The second one, which I think is really important, is the one that was announced yesterday by Biden's administration and also Boris Johnson's administration in UK to put a ban on importing oil and gas from Russia to United States and United Kingdom. And if you think about energy resources, this is really the key source of revenue for Russia and its government. So it's really like kind of targeting the artery of the country. So this should really have a devastating impact, both in a short run today and also in the longer term, because they're actually going to move away from your resources. It's more difficult for Europe to do this, and I think it has been highlighted a lot. The key reason is they depend so much on Russian energy. For instance, the natural gas, 40% of it is supplied by Russia to Europe. Nevertheless, EU announced, I think a few days ago, or maybe even yesterday, that by 2023, they plan to cut back 2/3 of imports from Russia. So think about this as actually having a very severe blow to Russia's economy in a medium term already. So now the question is, what do we already see happening in Russia? So since the war started, the Russian ruble has lost about 40%, actually probably more than 40% of the value against dollar. And it's important to note that this value is likely to be a huge underestimate, because many institutions don't even trade ruble anymore. So you actually don't really know what the true price really is. There are a lot of capital controls, a lot of restrictions, what you can do with the ruble. So 40% probably is just an optimistic estimate. So the central bank has already doubled the interest rates from 9.5 to 20% in hopes to actually prevent run against ruble and also tame the inflation. The risk of Russian bonds is now assessed to be close to default. In fact, I think the markets expect for Russian bonds to default in April. Russian share prices of companies listed abroad have dropped by 90%. Russians are queuing outside banks to get money. So they are actually really worried about this. The Russian stock market is closed since the start of the war to prevent the fear of fire sales. So when they open, everyone's going to start selling and put a huge negative pressure on the asset values there. I think what's very surprising here as well is that Western businesses such as Nike, Boeing, KPMG, name it, are voluntarily exiting Russia. And you can even read even Chinese banks shy away of working with Russian financial institutions because they are afraid that they also might then be sanctioned by the Western institutions dealing with these institutions. So in some sense, everything Russian has become so toxic that it's just excluded from the financial system. So the Russian economy currently is really in a free fall, and how low it's going to fall, nobody really knows so far. So the key question I think here is, will we achieve what we want, right? Will these sanctions actually achieve the stop of the conflict? So that's really the key question. And as you could see from all the other speakers, it's extremely hard to tell that, right? Putin has expressed his clear determination to proceed at whatever is the cost almost. Targeting oligarchs seems to be less effective, since remember, when Putin came to power, one of his key policies was actually limit the power of oligarchs. So whoever we see is not even clear how powerful they are when they have to come to actual decision making. And it also seems quite evident Putin and whatever, I think I agree a lot with James, you can't blame only Putin himself, but it's clear that Putin is more concerned about this empire building hypothesis rather than actually the well-being of the citizens of Russia. And if you think about what happens if the government is not really caring anymore about the well-being of citizens, there might be a lot of collateral damage going forward. We have a lot of historical precedents of what happens if you put severe sanctions like Iran, Venezuela, North Korea. They work, but not to the fullest extent that we might actually want them to do. So will it be effective to achieve what we want to do, stop the conflict? Only time will tell. So we must hope that these sanctions kind of dry out resources of the government or mobilize the country itself to raise and fight the regime. It's not cheap, it's not easy, and it's not fast. So what do these sanctions actually imply for the rest of the world? This clearly is going to be costly. Measuring the effect of financial sanctions apart from military effects is going to be tricky because there's a lot of, ports are closed, ships are attacked, so a lot of things happen in the same time. It's clear commodity prices are going to go up, oil, grain, and natural gas, metals, that's all going to go up and affect everyone in the West. In terms of food prices, gasoline price, we already know. But there might be a lot more contagion effects that we don't know. And we also have to remember Russia still can retaliate by banning some of these things. So I want to leave a little bit more time. I want to conclude with only one kind of last point is that at this moment seems to be that Mr. Putin's fortress is actually crumbling. So thank you.
Fantastic. Another great set of comments. I think all four have really helped us see many of the active dynamics at play here. And I've been getting a number of comments from people who are saying this is really helping them understand the many moving parts of the conflict. So thank you to all. We do have some time, so I'd like to actually take some questions from the panelists, from the audience. And I'll go back to the top here with Jim. There's a couple of questions here about the Ukrainian national narrative. Is that something that you can speak to or help us understand how Ukrainians think about themselves in the world and with regard to Russia?
Yeah, thanks very much. I saw that question. It's a good one. I think it's important to understand not everybody in a society buys into and lives by a national narrative. If you haven't noticed, we have different national narratives going around in America. So we don't just all live by one lockstep. So I'm not saying that everybody, that's where the grandmothers come in, for example. They say, I'm going to go against this. In Ukraine, it actually does have an alternative national narrative. And it's hard to talk about this and not sound like a booster, an American booster or something. But basically, it has to do with the very arduous pursuit of liberty from other countries. And that's meant Poland, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russia at different times, Turks. And if you just to capture it in a nutshell, a soundbite, so it makes it way too simple. If you think of what the prototypical Ukrainian story would be, it would be the story of the Cossacks, which are kind of like cowboys in America, this free spirit, refusal to be dominated by anybody, really very likely to be very vicious in those who try to dominate them. So there's even a great little book from a few years ago called The Cowboy and the Cossack. It's kind of an ethnographic account of how cowboys and Cossacks, they could settle how to move their cattle around. The hell with the rest of the world. That's the kind of idea that a lot of people in Ukraine have. And by the way, right now, whatever the national narrative is, Putin is generating something on the order of 50,000 new Ukrainian serious patriots, if not overly serious patriots every day.
That's great. There's a number of questions here about the military issues, Drew. Should NATO get involved? Should the United States be doing more? Should Poland be allowed to sell or to give some of those planes to the Ukrainian Air Force? And should we construct a no-fly zone over Ukraine? So to the extent that you're able to talk about that, if you could comment on those.
Yeah, sure, Krister. So, one of the things first, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on American policy. But what I think may be instructive is just to talk about some of the challenges and the difficulties that would be that would kind of be involved in some of the question or related to the questions that we've got here. One thing is, as was mentioned before, this is a major war. This is a serious war that has that has possibilities of a conflagration into something that's much larger. And there are opportunities for accidents to happen. And when accidents happen, when kind of friction is happening among nations, that's when it can get a little bit difficult or a little bit dangerous. So one of the questions, there was a question about attacking that 40-mile convoy that was to the north, or that was reported to be the north of Kiev. And again, and one thing is, I do not know what the current status of the Ukrainian Air Force would be, but what I can tell you is the kind of the difficulty that is involved in bringing air on that type of force. First of all, air-ground integration is something that is difficult and challenging and necessary, particularly for fast movers here. But also, we've got the reports that there's actually an air superiority fight that's going on. So that's air to air. The two competing nations competing for local air superiority. That has a couple of different components. You've got the air-to-air aspect, but you've also got ground capability that's trying to create an air defense bubble around a certain area. So they will be threatening whatever air is coming inside of that region. Now, in that sense, or in that light, if you start to think about a country in which there's a conflict where there's an air-to-air superiority fight that's happening, if third parties start being introduced into that air-to-air fight, that's when you start to get those opportunities for accidents to happen. So, in that context, I think that's instructive to help us understand, the challenges that our nations right now are really dealing with as they're making these decisions. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, that's great. So Leila, I think you can also see the questions too, and you realize there's been a number of those coming in for you regarding what actual tools and instruments does the ICC have to go after what may become war criminals, and you did distinguish between whether they're crimes, what types of crimes they are, and whether you can actually charge someone with being a war criminal because it involves intent. But to what extent, I think a lot of people would like to know, could Russian generals or even Putin himself be brought up on war crimes or brought to The Hague?
Yeah, this is one, again, where we're seeing, and I put in the chat the resolution introduced by Lindsey Graham, of all people, who is supporting the ICC activity. So it's wonderful to see the ICC finally recognized for what it can do. These are going to be playing, I think, as Janis, we're playing a long game here. So in the Sudan situation, for example, when genocide was alleged in Darfur, and it was clearly ongoing, and Sudan doesn't have any of the weaponry that Russia has, right? The president of Sudan went from country to country and basically said the ICC has no jurisdiction, you can't arrest me. He got China to invite him, he made himself into a cause célèbre. But what we see in almost every one of these cases, the combined effect of military action, diplomatic action, economic sanctions, court judgments, is to eventually isolate the individual and the individuals around them in their country. We saw this with Milosevic, we saw this with Bashir, who ended up in jail, arrested by the Sudanese, not by the International Criminal Court. And so what we really are doing, I think, with all of this is we are encircling Putin with a lot of techniques and tactics, short of no-fly zones and direct military confrontation, that are going to make it very uncomfortable for him and major leaders to be safe where they are. They want to be able to travel. They want to be able to send their athletes places. The oligarchs want to have property in London and New York, etc. We've had a lot from Russia, right? 2008, 2014, Syria, 2011. That was in the chat as well. The Russians were giving cover to Assad as chemical weapons were being used. I mean, I think one of the things we're hoping by having an active ICC negotiation isn't so much that we'll be able to nab individuals immediately, but that we might have some kind of small deterrent effect on some of the worst kinds of crimes that are yet to come, right? I don't want to scare people, but there's a lot of other stuff that could happen. And we saw in Syria the use of chemical weapons, and we know that that is not an option that I think Russia would forego. So what we're really hoping is we're playing a long game. We're trying to cut that cycle of impunity and say, no more, you've crossed a line. Whoever it is who's actually guilty of ordering the crimes or committing the crimes is going to be held criminally responsible. And not, by the way, not just by the ICC, but universal jurisdiction actions all over the world. Germany's been trying Syrians actually for actions coming, war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Syrian war. There have been trials of Afghans, there have been trials of Liberians. The United States is looking at adopting crimes against humanity legislation. And my big project, we're looking at a new global treaty on crimes against humanity. So we're sort of like the Lilliputians trying to tie down Gulliver here. And it's, impunity leads to these kind of crimes, and we're trying to get accountability and justice, but it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be quick.
Slow turning wheels of justice. You did mention Syria. There are unconfirmed reports that Putin's actually looking to bring in Syrian fighters into Ukraine to do the street-to-street, house-to-house fighting, should that become necessary. Again, that's unconfirmed, but you're right, there are lots of scary possible scenarios down the road here. There are a number of interesting questions here about sanctions, Janis, which you've probably seen here too, regarding Russian consumer goods and the impact that will have, as well as, is it possible there could be a sort of cascading or domino effect from these sanctions on other parts of the global economy? I wonder if you can speak to that.
So yeah, on the cascading effect, actually for the consumer dependence first. What I read today, so think about Russia, I think in food, they are self-dependent. So they actually produce enough themselves so they can, survive. They have enough to eat. When it comes to external consumer goods, especially the more advanced one, that actually is very limited. So think about the Russian Lada, which is, very primitive car, if you can define it like that. What was announced today that they actually stopped manufacturing it because they can't even get supplies for that primitive car. So we're not even talking about something very complex, but something very simple. So I would imagine that this will have a very huge effect. They have already started to ration how much you can buy from shops in Russia. So it's clear evidence that something is going to happen. You can't really just substitute stuff very easily. What is going to mean to us? Commodities, right? Russia is a commodity economy, are crucial for us. So think about nickel, which is actually one of the key ingredients for electric vehicles, have increased 4 times in price since the conflict. So it's clearly going to have a huge effect. So if you start going after energy, it's going to have huge effect. Ukraine and Russia, I think, is third largest, like 1/3 of wheat production comes from there internationally. So it's going to be very massive effects. It's going to affect our prices. It's going to be important kind of cost for us. So that's going to be, I think, the real contagion is going to come through these prices, right? Because there's going to be supply chain problems. The resources you can't get from there, that's going to push up prices everywhere, and it's going to really affect the real economy, increase prices, and kind of already something we are worried about, the inflation here. If you think about the contagion from financial point of view, so I've read reports that analyze this one. What kind of people who have actually analyzed this say that the Western countries haven't really been exposed in financial terms to Russia very heavily. There are few European banks that have some exposure, some Unicredit in Italy and Raiffeisen Bank in Austria, I think, that have some considerable exposure, but like Unicredit said, if they have to close, they lose 7 billion euro, which doesn't seem to be crazy. So it seems that it's not going to be the same thing, that there's cascading effects because of financial markets, but the real economy, I think we will feel, all of us, a little bit. Thank you.
Fantastic. We only have a little bit of time left, so I want to do one final lightning round, but I should say that a couple of themes are emerging here for me and perhaps for our audience. And I have to say that after this hour and a half, I'm actually a little bit more hopeful than I was at the beginning, which is to say that Drew, the Russian military seems to be bogged down. Leila, the long arm of the law, will be coming for the perpetrators. And apropos of Janis's comments, that the Russian economy is in free fall and will take a long time to recover if it ever does. But Jim, your point about whether it's Putin or those around him or the next leader, that they are deeply connected. It's in their DNA to this deep Russian narrative about victimology, the Ruski Mir. This is something that does not seem to be going away. And that even as we manage all of this inside of Ukraine to the best that we can, and hopefully that it will stay there, this will be an ongoing problem. What I'd like to just get from you as we close for the day is in a kind of lightning round, if you will, is we've got several questions about, can this become a wider war? You've all said that this will likely be a long war, but could this spill over into Transnistria and in the section between Ukraine and Moldova? Could Putin make a grab for one or more of the Baltic states, particularly trying to open up a land corridor to Kaliningrad across Lithuania? Could he go back into Georgia? And more so, could it actually spill over into a NATO conflict? To the extent that any or all of you want to reply to that, from your own areas of expertise, that would be great. Jim, we can start with you.
Yes, this could easily spill over to, and a lot of it has to do with what the point that Drew made. Accidents happen, and once they happen, things are out of control. You have to respond in seconds to this, that, and the other. So that's extremely dangerous. I would also say, going back to some of the things that Leila said, I would like nothing better than to see him see her put him in international criminal court triumphs. I'm not saying that Putin is not responsible for this, but I am saying we underestimate what's going on if we focus on him individually, because I do see a very long, and they have a right to a national narrative, of course, but he's invaded a sovereign country, and that's just the bottom line where all his excuses fall out.
Yeah, I might just add to that. One of the most powerful statements in the Security Council was the Kenyan ambassador. And the Kenyan ambassador literally said, you know, all of us have our national narratives. When decolonization happened, our country was created, and it was created improperly. But you have to learn to deal with that, just as we've had to learn to deal with that. You can't live off the embers of your dead empire. It was incredibly poetic, but to the point that the African countries were sitting there saying, you know, we're not trying to redraw the map of Africa because we didn't like the way it was drawn in decolonization. And Mr. Putin, you don't get to do that either. And I think that is a difficult, it's always easy to have a nationalist narrative that plays to domestic politics and that inspires you. But at the end of the day, the world just can't survive that kind of that kind of narrative. It's just unacceptable. And it was really wonderful to see other states standing up and challenging him that way.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Krister. So yeah, just again, not to pour water on the good news. The good way of looking at the situation. Well, I think that the Russians are going to slow down in their tempo will remain. So I do think that while everything is going to slow down, I think it's going to include some more mass before hopefully unless we find a diplomatic solution, which we can all hope for in this. And talk about the expansion of the conflict. One thing I do think is the possibility or the likelihood what Russia thought they were going to be able to do, or what we think Russia thought they were going to be able to do with a faster offensive that would result in a fairly quick, perhaps a fairly quick regime change. I think that Ukrainian nationalism may be deep-seated, and the widespread irregular warfare might be something that we're going to see depending on how the outcome of this fight, if this is a slugfest the next number of months. And then just in terms of we talked about accidents, we talked about the wider case of the war. I will say that one of the things I talk about with my cadets is the United States Army, the United States military provides hope and fear. And right now, the fear side, we've got lots of American forces that are supporting our NATO allies, and they're there to hopefully deter anything from expanding. But the hope aspect, we also have American soldiers that are supporting the response to this humanitarian crisis that has been created as a result of this unfortunate series of events. So, not overwhelmingly rosy, but hope in terms of the expansion of the conflict, to see it inside, and we'll see what happens tomorrow, let alone next week.
So my last comment is that, you can expect now there could be some trade conflicts between the countries. I'm sure there are going to be. Longer term, probably what's going to happen, different autocracies actually going to create different ways how to protect themselves against financial weapons of the US and Western allies, create different payment systems. And that's something we really have to think about, how to ensure that we are always the best and nobody can live without us. And so the very last thing I want to mention, I was actually born in the Soviet Union, and I'm from one of the Baltic states. I'm from Latvia. And we've been afraid of this scenario since 1990, when we actually got independence. So it's not really surprising in some sense to us, but it's extremely worrying. So if you can see a lot of change in the mood. So if you even open news or radio, listen to radio, you can start hearing patriotic war songs slowly. So people are kind of, emotions are building up, and I really, truly, truly hope no accident happens that gets things out of control. So with that, I want to end.
Well, I think we'll end on that note of realism, which may temper my more optimism, but is at least not pessimism. So we'll try to strike a moderate middle ground. I want to thank all of our panelists, Professors James Wertsch, Leila Sadat, Drew Betson, and Janis Skrastins. And of course, our audience members for their fantastic questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to everyone, but we are out of time. So I want to thank you all for attending this very special webinar on crisis in Ukraine, past, present, and future. And we'll be hopefully seeing you in the future. Take care, everyone. Thank you very much.